Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of the IELTS Plus English podcast. And it's a lovely, easy topic today, neighbourhood. So I was looking at the curriculum recently. I saw this lovely topic was coming up, neighbourhood. It's an easy one, I think we can say. We can all talk about our neighbourhood. So I thought, let's give myself an extra challenge. My challenge today is that I'm going to follow my strategy and structures that are in my textbook as closely as I can. That will make it very difficult to, I've got to get all of the vocabulary in. I've got to do this podcast and video it, but I've got to also stick to these structures to show you exactly how I approach the IELTS exam. Of course, if I took the exam personally, I would study the structures, study the vocabulary, but when it comes to the day, I would actually just freestyle and use the structures and strategies just as my base, but allow myself to work within them. Today, I'm going to be very strict and show you exactly how I approach and my students here approach the IELTS speaking exam. So hopefully you'll get some value from this. There will be a student challenge, and your student challenge today is what can be done to improve your neighbourhood. We all live in a neighbourhood, and hopefully you like it. I'm pretty satisfied with mine, but what can be done to improve it? Please let me know in the comments below. I will check and give you some feedback. So let's get straight into it today. I'm a little nervous. I think this is a bit of a tough challenge because I've got to consider today's language. I've got to consider my strategy and structures and then videoing this podcast. So we'll see how we go. But I will give you some notes as well, what I did, how I approached the question. So let's listen to my first part 1 question. Part 1, question 1. Can you describe your neighbourhood? Yes, I live in a neighbourhood in East Seoul called Gangdong. It's a fairly busy neighbourhood. It's got a nice community. Quite close-knit in the area I live in, but it's developing and it's getting bigger and more modern, and in some ways that's a good thing, but in some ways not. So what did I do there? I kept it simple. It's a part 1. I aimed to give you about 3 sentences. I gave you the direct answer, and I gave you 2 details. As you'll see in my textbook, on the most basic level, your details are going to be a why or a what. Now, you'll see there are other ways of giving details, definitely, but on the most basic level, it's a why and a what, and in this case, I gave 2 whats. What is in my neighbourhood? So that's how I answered that question, and let's move on to the next part 1. What do you like most about your neighbourhood? I like the main area, the high street, we would call it in England. I like this area because it's a bustling district of my neighbourhood, and there are lots of shops, lots of people, and it's really created this nice, busy community in my area. So again, what you can perhaps hear today, differently to previous podcasts, is that it's just a bit cleaner. There are more clear sort of end of sentences and then details. So I hope today you can more easily pick up, whether you're watching the video or listening to Spotify, you can just hear the parts of my answer, the direct answer, and then the details. So again, in this case, I gave the answer was the high street, and then I said why. So that's part 1 done, easy as usual. And now let's go to part 2. Now, I'm not going to go through my whole structure, but I do want you to listen carefully because I think you will hear me pause and show very clear sections of my answer. So let's give that a go. I'm putting 2 minutes on the clock, and today's question is, describe a neighborhood you have lived in. Describe a neighborhood you have lived in. Okay, so 2 minutes are on the clock. My time starts now. I'd like to tell you about my current neighborhood, Gangdong, in the east of Seoul. I first moved to this neighborhood in 2017. And when I came to that neighborhood, it's definitely a little run down. It wasn't as modern as it is now. And I wasn't particularly excited to move there. But we found a nice house and it was within our budget. We certainly liked how the Han River, the main river in Seoul, was very accessible from our neighborhood. And, there were some nice shops and restaurants and things like that. So we felt it was a decent community to move into. Let me tell you a little more about my neighborhood. This is a suburban area of Seoul. It's on the eastern side and it's very near the outskirts of Seoul. And it has always been, as I said, a bit of a run-down area, but about 5 years ago, they started doing some serious renovation and really improving the area with schools, apartments, restaurants, coffee shops, and it's really come on a lot in the time that I've lived there. It has a nice community. I think the people around us are quite neighborly because they're a little on the old side. They're fairly elderly. And so it's built this nice community of people who help each other out and say hello in the street. And I really like that. For me personally, this is a great neighborhood for the stage in our life. But in the future, I'd like to move somewhere a little more modern and somewhere that would be more appropriate for my daughter, who is going to go to school one day. She's too young for that now. Wow, there you go. So I actually, what you'll notice there is definitely a clear past. I started with the past. I moved on to the present, which was describing my neighborhood. And then I moved on to the future. Now, what I do in my structure, and you can look at this in more detail in the textbook, but I give an opinion towards the end, and then I talk about the future. But what I did there, not necessarily on purpose, but I combined opinion and future, and it turned out quite well. I was quite happy with that. So it was, again, pretty clean answer, not exactly how I would approach it in the exam. I'd love to use a little more vocabulary, but just showing you today a really strict structure that would, with colorful language, would definitely get you that band 7 if that's what you're aiming for. Okay, let's go to part 3. And this is a type of question I get a lot of questions about. They're really challenging. So let me just preface this a little. Part 3, I'm aiming for answers around 45 seconds to a minute. That's what I like. If you are someone who likes to count sentences, then you're probably looking around 5 or 6 sentences. I'm not a fan of doing that, but if that's what you like, it's 5 or 6 sentences. And what you'll hear is a direct answer. You'll hear some details. And then very importantly, I want to finish with a really specific example. And I want the example, ideally, to be about society, not about me personally. So let's see how that goes. The first question is, what are the main differences between urban and rural neighborhoods? I would say that the main difference between urban and rural neighborhoods is the feeling of community, the sense of community. In the cities, there's just so many people and the houses or apartments are so stuck together. There's not much space. People have really fast lifestyles. They work, they come home, they go back to work again. It's not a lifestyle that's conducive to making a nice community and socializing with your neighbors, helping each other out, working in someone else's garden with something they're doing. In rural communities, on the other hand, life is a little slower. There's a bit more space, a bit more freedom. You've got houses with gardens rather than these apartments packed together. And I think in that case, people socialize more and they feel a bit happier to be part of a close-knit community. A good example of this is where my parents live now in the UK. They live in a nice rural community outside of Nottingham in the UK, and the neighbours socialise a lot. They have dinners together. They have all these different meetings and they help each other out. And I think that's a great example of the difference between these rural and urban communities. Okay, I liked that answer. Now, you'll notice that wasn't such a society example, but it was about my parents. It wasn't just a typical I example. So I was reasonably happy with that. And you heard, I gave my answer. I gave details regarding urban, details regarding rural, and then, I backed it all up with the example of my parents in the UK. So that's a very typical example of my approach to a part 3. And let's do another one. What can be done to improve a neighbourhood? I think that the main thing that we can do to improve a neighbourhood is making community spaces, the government making community spaces. Now, that can be parks, it can be exercise equipment, it can be, that there's these facilities for the elderly, there's libraries, there's various facilities that encourage the community to come together in these spaces and share space, share ideas, and chat and socialize. So I think that's a great thing that can be done for neighborhoods. Recently, in my neighborhood in Seoul, there was some new exercise equipment installed in the park. And it seems like a relatively small thing to do, but it was such high quality equipment that a lot of people from the neighborhood nowadays flock to that equipment in order to use it. And I went there recently and I noticed people were talking to each other, and even someone talked to me how to use, he explained how to use the equipment. So I was really impressed by that. Now, what you'll notice there, firstly, I did talk about my neighborhood. So I did avoid me. I inserted myself into the example at the end because I thought it was relevant. To be clear, what we don't want to be doing is every single example is, I did this, I did that, I feel like this, because it's too easy to prepare, and it means that you are taking the answer focus onto you every time, and that's not the point of part 3s. So, be careful with that. I slightly did it there, but I will avoid it in the last one. Definitely, we want to maybe do it once or twice, but maximum once or twice. Last question. Why do some people prefer to live in the same neighborhood for a long time? I think that people prefer to live in the same neighborhood because they become comfortable, and I think often the desire or relocating is really difficult. It's really hard to do. And you get comfortable, you find your community, you are comfortable with the lifestyle there. And I think it becomes difficult to move on from there and move to a new community of people you've got to make friends with. You see that a lot in the UK, these small villages particularly, because they have such a tight community that they've spent their entire life there very happily. So, I don't look down on them in any way. They live there very happily. And yeah, that's a perfect example to illustrate how people can live for a very long time in one community. Okay, well, that's it. Now, one more note, and I keep meaning to say this because it's so important. So if you stay to the end, I've got a golden tip, or in Korea, we call it a honey tip for you. You'll notice with those questions, the part 3, that they were kind of wanting maybe multiple ideas. So for example, what are the main differences? What can be done to improve a neighborhood? That, like, you could give a list of ways to or a list of answers, right? That's what it feels like it's wanting. One of the biggest tips I give is just always try to zoom in on one thing. So if they say, what are the differences between A and B? Answer, I think the main difference is, and then really focus on that. The reason I tell people to do that is it makes a cleaner answer and it allows you to go more in depth and not stay on the surface. If you start listing, that's just a very surface level answer, whereas we want depth, we want examples. So I'm not saying you can't do it, but I advise my students here, especially if you're going for that band 7, try to focus on one answer and go deep rather than wide. And that's everything we have time for today. I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly did, but it was a challenge. And next week, we have another reasonable topic, to be honest. It's online shopping. So have a lovely week. Study as hard as I know you always do. And I'll see you next week to talk about online shopping.